Greetings from the New York Society Library, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Holliday from the library's events department. As you may have heard us boast once or twice, the New York Society Library was founded in 1754, making us the oldest library in New York City, one of the oldest in the United States, and very much a project of our founders' Enlightenment ideals. This was before public libraries existed as we know them now, and the only kind of public library was, like us, based on membership subscriptions. We're still like that, open to the public for many functions, with anyone welcome to become a member to check out books. To tell us more about libraries of the 18th century and their special project studying them, we're delighted to have Dr. Sophie Jones and Dr. Mark Towsey. Dr. Jones is a lecturer in modern British history at the University of Liverpool and has been a postdoctoral research associate on the libraries, reading communities, and cultural formation in the 18th century Atlantic project since it began in October 2019. A historian of the 18th century British Atlantic, she has published on a range of topics, including loyalism, early modern merchant families, 18th century subscription libraries, and early modern literacy. Dr. Mark Towsey leads the project, Libraries, Reading Communities, and Cultural Formation in the 18th Century Atlantic, working with collaborators and partners across the UK, USA, and Australia. He is primarily interested in the history of reading in the 18th and 19th centuries, using the practice and experience of reading in the past as a key to understanding much broader social and cultural processes across the English-speaking world. You can learn more about today's speakers and their project on our website, and I'll add that link to the chat. Please feel free to add your questions and comments to the chat throughout the presentation, or you can also email them directly to me, and that address will be visible there momentarily. I'm now going to yield the virtual stage to Dr. Mark Towsey and Dr. Sophie Jones, and I hope you enjoy this conversation on libraries of the Enlightenment.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the library for hosting us for this really exciting event. We've been partnering with the library for the past 4 years on a really exciting big project on 18th century libraries, and we've shared several updates on several different occasions, so it's really nice today to be able to share what is very nearly the final product. We were hoping to be able to have a bit of a soft launch today of the very, very final thing, but there are a few little technical glitches with the database that means it's not quite ready to be published, but it is there and it is living, and it's got a lot of very, very exciting data. And it's particularly exciting to be here with you at New York because one of the places where the project came from was a sequence of events and network and research programs that we really started on this journey back in about 2010, 2011. Colleagues involved in the project were part of a network that I put together with colleagues across North America and Europe, meeting in Liverpool and Chicago and London to think about what a digital approach to library history in the 18th century would look like. Colleagues from the New York Society Library came along to talk about that, and the City Readers database was one of the early examples and one of the early models that we were engaging with when we were thinking about what a digital history of 18th century libraries and reading and book collections could look like. So it's really exciting to be able to have kept going with that relationship. I think a group of us who are still involved in this project came across to New York in Snowzilla. I think it was January 2016, to have a workshop in person in the library and talking about our various interests. So it's really nice to be here at the end of what has felt like a very long journey. So Sophie, if I can ask you for the next slide. So Sophie's running our PowerPoint and will be taking over in the second part of the talk. I'm going to run you through the background of the project. And it's and apologies to Sarah for the very wordy formal title of the project, which is at the head of this slide. It is a project that was very fortunate to get quite a lot of UK government funding in 2019 from our Arts and Humanities Research Council to look at 18th century libraries. We are quite a big complex team, so it's been quite a difficult thing to keep on the road during the last 3 or 4 years, obviously, for obvious reasons. And in fact, most of the team didn't meet each other until April of this year. But we have myself, I'm the PI, the principal investigator, as you have on grants like these at universities. We have 3 postdoctoral research associates over the last 4 years. Sophie being the one who's been here all the way along and has played the most important role in building our data structures and collating our North American data. We've had a project manager, we've had several PhD students. We've been very lucky to have quite a few undergraduate student interns that have worked with us at the University of Liverpool. And then we also have 7 co-investigators elsewhere. So they represent different disciplinary backgrounds. As you heard, I come from an intellectual history background and have become really, really interested in the history of reading in my career. Sophie is particularly interested in North America and the Revolution, and loyalists, particularly in the Revolution. But we also have someone who's a historian of religion. We have people from literature departments who are interested in travel writing and novels, and the idea of the institution, the literary institution in the 18th century. We have someone who works on the history of science, and we have people that work on French literature and German literature and digital humanities themselves. So we've got quite a large team precisely so that we can work out how the database should operate and should best function, but also so that when we get to this stage and we've got lots and lots of amazing data to play with, that we've got lots of people from different university departments and disciplinary backgrounds who can look at that data and start sort of thinking about how different people from different backgrounds will want to use the data. So that's the point we're at now. We've also all the ways through the project been working with 9 library partners, of which New York is probably the longest established, given the background going back to the early 20-teens of working together. The rest of the partners are on the board on the slide. It's a collection of surviving 18th century library institutions in terms of the Linen Hall in Belfast or New York itself, or the Library Company in Philadelphia, Hatboro and Burlington as well. We have a couple of institutions there in the Birmingham and Midland Institute in the UK, and the State Library of New South Wales in Sydney in Australia, who started life as subscription libraries in the 18th century and became something else. And we have 2 libraries, Bristol and Liverpool, both in the UK, that are public library systems in big cities that inherited the papers and quite a lot of the books, actually, although they don't have a very full sense of which books they do have, that used to belong to now defunct 18th century subscription libraries, one of which is in the image on this slide. So next slide, please, Sophie. So we put together quite a big team, complex team, to deliver what has turned into quite an overly ambitious project brief, really. Our focus was subscription libraries, and as Sarah has already indicated, they are a very specific kind of library. Reading is becoming very popular in the 18th century. It is really the first generation, the mid-18th century, where ordinary people would be interested in reading both for entertainment and for self-education. And we're talking about a time here where not very many people went to university or did much formal education. So it's got twin focal points, these libraries. Reading and books are very popular for these 2 reasons, but books are still very expensive. The paper out of which 18th century books are hand produced are very, very expensive still, beyond the means of most people, and certainly to have a collection of 200 or 300 books would be beyond the means of most people in the 18th century. That's even more the case when war strikes and the raw product behind paper becomes even more scarce and expensive. And as you may know, 18th century Europe and America is at war a lot. So books are expensive, but as Sarah indicated, we don't have public libraries in the form we know about them until the mid-19th century with the Boston Public Library or the British Public Libraries Act of 1850. So what subscription libraries are filling is a gap. They're a new form of library based on voluntary membership fees, voluntary subscriptions. They tend to be called subscription libraries in the UK. They are very often known as social libraries, library companies in North America. They have sometimes been called proprietary libraries because of the specific kinds of membership scheme that underpin them. They also sometimes take on other names. The Amicable Society of Lancaster is a subscription library. The Manchester Circulating Library in the UK is a subscription library. What's really important is that they're different from other kinds of 18th century library provision. The famous library provision that Jane Austen would talk about in her novels, that you see playwrights like Sheridan talking about, are the commercial circulating libraries. They're run by booksellers for profit, and the decision about which books are on offer are made by the bookseller. You also have cathedral libraries, church libraries, but there the decision about what books are on offer are made by other kinds of people. Gentry libraries, aristocratic libraries, big libraries owned by mercantile families, these are sometimes made open to other members of the community, but it's on a very ad hoc basis, and the choice of books and the control of access to books is very much dependent on the person who owns them. The subscription library or the social library or the New York Society Library is different because it's built around the principle of subscription, and essentially of community-based decisions about what books to buy and how they are made available. And this is a really, really interesting principle from the point of view of historians, literature scholars, but also hopefully the general public. We can think about because ordinary readers, members of libraries, are making decisions about what books are bought. It helps us think about what they're interested in. It helps us think about their reading tastes, and that can give us all sorts of useful information about whether anyone was paying attention to the Enlightenment, whether they're more interested in reading salacious novels than they are reading the latest philosophy of Voltaire or Rousseau or Hume. It can tell us how popular the ideas of revolutionary figures or counter-revolutionary figures might have been amongst a wide reading public. It can tell us about how reading habits and reading tastes change and how they shape community values. So how quickly does the poet Robert Burns and his poems, how quickly is he taken up by library communities in Scotland, in Britain, in North America, and how quickly does that feed into the sense that Burns stands for Scottish identity? And we can think about, on a much broader basis, how quickly do books start to form the basis of nascent national identity, the new national identity of an independent America, or the growing national identity that you get in Ireland or in Scotland, or even in Britain during this period. So it can help us answer some really interesting puzzles. It can also help us think about new reading audiences. This is the first generation, as I've said, where reading is really popular for entertainment and self-education beyond the traditional elites. So we can think about what that means. We can also think about the wider opportunities that a library offers for intellectual networking, but also for social networking, for political networking, for economic networking. And these are all of the reasons why we've wanted to put together this data. So Sophie, next slide, please. Subscription libraries are also really interesting because they sort of reverse the usual trend. In 18th century history, a lot of things start in the metropole, start in an imperial centre, either London or Paris or or Berlin, or whichever empire you're talking about, and then filter out. What happens with libraries is that they start on the start in the province. And in this case, in Philadelphia, which is a long, long way away from London. And it's a long, long way from all of the bookshops and other things and the authors that make London the centre of intellectual and cultural life in the Anglophone world in the first part of the 18th century. And then they spread very quickly. And in Philadelphia and in other places, they are a means by which a group of interested intellectual people, political people perhaps, can get access to a wider number of books than they would be able to afford individually. They're pooling their resources. And as you can see on this list, these libraries quickly move across the colonial eastern seaboard of America. They then hop across in people's heads, in newspapers that are circulating and reporting on this amazing new idea of the library, in the heads of a merchant who gets off a ship in Liverpool and tells other people, I've seen this really exciting new idea, a library that people in Charleston have. Maybe we should do something similar. And then someone from Liverpool talks to his brother who's living in Warrington and says, there's this idea of a library, you should try it. And then that spreads to people elsewhere. And you see it sort of spreading, its fingers spreading out across the northern parts of mainland United Kingdom, Great Britain, the Scottish borders, the great industrial towns of northern England, and then filtering out from there. By the end of the 18th century, there's something like 350 of these libraries in North America and the British Isles. So you start from a single base, but very quickly you spread. Sophie, next slide, please. And what we've been interested in doing is building an open access database that helps us as scholars, as historians, as literary critics, but also the general public, also the libraries themselves that survive from this period, or the libraries that have inherited papers from this period, of libraries that no longer exist. Building a big public database that anyone can use, that contains all of as many of the surviving records or data points that we can get. So over the succeeding slides, I'm going to show you broadly what we have, and then I'll hand over to Sophie to talk you through what the database currently looks like. So the first thing we're trying to do is collect all known surviving sets of boring records. So the records that take us closest to the reading experience, like this example on the slide from Hapra in Pennsylvania, where we can put specific books in a specific individual's hands at a specific date and time. And obviously New York is very prominent here with 40,000 loans. We also have 40,000 loans from Bristol. We have smaller runs from Burlington in New Jersey, and Hapra in Pennsylvania, Wigton in Scotland, Lewis in England. There's a very, very, very small number of these sources surviving, but they're incredibly revealing for what 18th century people are reading. So Sophie, next slide. So 60 years ago now, a North American scholar, Washington scholar called Paul Kaufman did a very simple numerical counting analysis of the books that were borrowed from the Bristol Library over its first 10 years. And we've done that and then added the years up to 1800. And that book has been cited by virtually everyone who's written since about intellectual history in the 18th century or about reading tastes in the 18th century, because it gives us this amazing data. It shows us that in a rapidly growing Atlantic-facing port city, the travel writers of the 18th century are very popular. So Hawkesworth's voyages are right at the top. Dryden's tour through Sicily. This is exactly what you want merchants to be reading. But this is the centre of the British slave trade until Liverpool takes over. So what are Bristolians doing reading Raynal, the history of the European settlements in the Indies, which is probably the most pro-abolitionist text, anti-slavery text that is published during the Enlightenment? So what are Bristolians doing reading that? You also find, if we're looking for the reception of the Enlightenment, we're looking at really important figures here. David Hume, William Robertson, Edward Gibbon, all really big figures of the Enlightenment. But we're also seeing the emergence of the rise of the novel, of Tristram Shandy, of Henry Fielding's novels. So there's a really interesting snapshot here. I did something similar in my PhD, which is the right-hand side. Again, a very blunt instrument approach. This is the top 10 books borrowed from a very different kind of place, a tiny town in rural Scotland. And again, the same points could be made, that people in this tiny corner of rural Scotland are reading about the discovery of Australia in Captain Cook's voyages. They're reading major Enlightenment figures like David Hume and Edward Gibbon. They're also reading about Bell's British Theatre, which is a really interesting choice. It's a compilation of the great playwrights of the 16th and 17th and 18th century. It's being read in a town that is very closely associated with the most radical form of Presbyterian religion in Scotland, which only 20 years earlier had been desperately trying to excommunicate David Hume and other major figures of the Enlightenment for reading a play. So that's a really interesting nugget of cultural history that could be unpicked. Sophie, next slide, please. What we're then trying to do, if we skip over to the right-hand box, the pink box, we're looking at all surviving catalogues. So as I said, we have very few surviving sets of borrowing records. They're amazingly interesting, but how reliable are they? How representative are they? So what historians of reading and historians of ideas and literary critics and anyone else with an interest has always lacked is a sense of how different those 5 libraries might have been that we have borrowing records for. So what we're trying to do is, what we've been trying to do is put them in a much wider landscape of the books that libraries owned. And there we have catalogues for about 90 libraries. This slide is a little out of date because we've covered about 65 of those. That's where the over-ambition of the project comes in, because it's turned out that there are more catalogues that we knew about. But we now have data on which books libraries held for 65 libraries compared to 5 libraries for which we've got borrowing records. And that makes a big difference, as you'll see when we get to show off the data later on. Next slide, please. But this is just an indication of what looking at catalogues can show us. Our colleague Cheryl Knott, in a book that came out of the network I mentioned at the start, did a comparative study of 6 very, very small frontier libraries in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in the 1790s. These are very, very small libraries in very, very small places. And she found that these 6 libraries only had 4 books in common. And those books are really interesting because they include people like Adam Smith, major Enlightenment figure, and they include someone like Benjamin Franklin, who is doing that a lot of that identity forming work through his autobiography and stuff like that. But equally, she found that 68% of all of the books those libraries held were only held by one library. So if we're looking at libraries for something that might be forming a sort of national reading diet, then her evidence was that that isn't happening. And we're able to do that at much bigger scale now and put that alongside the borrowings. Next slide, please, Sophie. The final thing we're principally looking at in terms of the database is thinking about who the people are who are joining these things and borrowing books. And we've approached each individual listed in a library catalogue as a member. And we have tried as far as possible to find occupational data for as many of them as possible. And we've split that into 3 different ways. We talk about a tested occupation, which is how an individual themselves is describing their occupation or how they are described by contemporaries. We are then putting that into one of these standardized occupations. So there's lots of different ways of describing a merchant, but we've created a standard category called merchants and traders, and that accounts for by far the majority of our library members. What we've done, but we also get some really, really interesting occupations, as you can see further down: brewers, grocers, factors, customs collectors, smith workers, a lot of weavers, a very few criminals and smugglers that were much, much further down this list. If Sophie shows us the next slide, what we then do is put all of these standardized occupations into 14 occupational areas, and they start to reveal very clearly what's happening here. If you look at independent means, that means nobles, aristocrats, people with land. That means the traditional leaders of the old world society. And you can see that they're not really a very prominent part in this at all. The prominent people are the upwardly mobile merchants, bankers, manufacturers, artisans that are making the great big cities of 18th century Britain and America, and they're helping those grow. They are working in partnership with, and they lack education. They have financial means, but lack education. And what they're doing usually is partnering up with the traditional learned institutions, professions like the lawyers, the clergymen, the medical men that require specific knowledge and higher education, but don't necessarily have the cultural capital or the wealth to buy books. So those two groups are coming together to help build up these libraries as a key feature of civic society. And the politics office holders there, by the way, do include people like Thomas Jefferson or lots and lots of MPs, Edward Burke in the UK, you might have heard of. But generally, they are the same people as the merchants. They're the local mayors, the local aldermen, the local office holders. So we can learn quite a lot about civic society. We can learn quite a lot about potentially about how business is done by looking at these groups. And if you think about medics, in the early 18th century, a medical man is not much more than a quack. And one of the things that the Enlightenment does is give a lot more knowledge and a lot more understanding and a lot more respect to the role of the doctor, the medical doctor. And what a library is providing your surgeon or your physician is an opportunity to be taken seriously through his or sometimes her learning. I think, Sophie, at that point, shall I hand over to you and we will save... Oh, I've got one more slide, actually, if I may. Shall we look at the next slide? So one thing that I really wanted to say today is that the data comes from these sources, but we also have had to work, because this is a really big task, with other people in order to help us collate, organize, and sensibly structure this data. So we've worked with a group called Hurist, who are a spin-off company from the University of Sydney in Australia, who offer really interesting open source database platforms that is really appropriate for people doing historical humanities projects. And Sophie has, largely Sophie, has built up our data structures and a data plan from the open source tools that Hurist gives us in terms of people and books and places. What we've then also done, and has considerably sped up the process, is used linked all of our books to the English short title catalogue, which is a technical thing, but it's an almost universal catalogue of books that are known to have been printed up to 1800 in English. And that means that we've attached that to our database, and it means we don't have to write out every single bibliographical piece of data relating to a book. We've also been very fortunate to have been allowed to use some metadata from ESDC that a team at Helsinki had already considerably enriched with author biographical dates and things like that. We've also calibrated this with lots of similar projects. So particularly colleagues at Stirling or in Sydney or in London or in Nijmegen in the Netherlands have been busy doing similar things over the past 5, 10, 15 years. And we've wanted to make sure that our data potentially could be made to speak to their data one day. And the final thing, and this is where New York comes in really exciting, is that we've been able to incorporate City Readers metadata from the project that yourselves at the library and colleagues at the library have put together, working through Whirligig to access that metadata and then work out how to retrofit it with our identifier points. So on the screen, you see this is an image from our back end, and you can see that New York books have three fields that none of the rest of our books have. They have a New York Society Library book identifier number and a book ID number, and they have the New York Society Library's subject designations. And that means that one day we'll be able to make our data speak to City Readers' data if we think that's appropriate and useful. Sophie and I are both going to speak a little bit about how New York the City Readers database data has enriched the data we're doing. But what I'm going to do now is hand over straight to Sophie to speak through the database itself and what we've done. Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really delighted to actually be able to share the test website, and we're sharing it live. So welcome to what we're calling 18th Century Libraries Online. So a bit shorter and hopefully a bit easier than our full project title. So this database will be available on our project website. And I just wanted to flag, it is still the prototype. We're just ironing out a couple of final glitches. So if you do notice any bugs or anything that looks a bit odd, that's why. This database contains over 200,000 individual records relating to subscription libraries in the 18th century Atlantic, including information on people, books, and borrowing activity. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through what the database can do. And we'll move through the different types of searches. Don't worry if you don't catch all this now, there will be full guides on our website when the database does go live. So probably the best place to start is, let's do a simple search for a library. If you click on the libraries tab, it actually brings up all the libraries, so you are able to browse through and pick out one of the libraries that interest you. But let's start by looking at New York, as soon as we're in New York today. I'm going to look at the New York Society Library. So what this will do, and it does work, I've been working on it all day today. Whenever we share this over Zoom or on a live screen, it does slow down a little bit, and then we have this sort of nervy moment where we have to wait for it to load up. Oh, great. Okay. So it doesn't take that long when you're not sharing it and streaming it. So once we've selected the library, you can see information about it. So you can see where it is, whether or not it still exists, whether there were women members, because that's something we're asked a lot, and whether the 18th century collection still exists. We can also see all of the surviving institutional records that this library has. So these tend to be lists, library catalogues, any other institutional records that we've worked with as part of this project. And also anything, if you click through the banners, we can find out a little bit more information about the members. Now, I have a feeling that this is going to take a minute or two to load up. Right, it will appear, but we can click through the banners to see information about the library's members. Oh, excellent, here we go, with details for each. Let me sort them by people that, here we go, people that we actually have occupations for. So information about the library's members. We can also see information about the books held within the library catalogues, and the borrowing records. I'm not going to load up the borrowing records just now because there's 88,000 of them, and I think it's going to take a little bit too long. what we can do if the technology doesn't work, we have got backup slides as well. This is the fun of doing things remotely. But
So
that's all themed from. Oh, sorry, Mark.
Can we move to the backup slides, or are you happy?
Yeah, I think
Yep.
we might need to, unfortunately. Hang on one second.
The slides are all there still on the PowerPoint, so from 20 onwards.
Joke. Wonderful. Okay. So I'll move on. So that's what I want. I was able to show you what I wanted about the library. I might just revisit that. But the other thing you can do is search for a person. So by doing a simple search and selecting agent, essentially agent in our database means people. And the database contains two different groups of people, library members and authors. And I actually wanted to search for Hugh Gain because he's a member of the library from its beginning in 1754 right the way through. And we have some borrowing records for him as well. Now, these slides are from earlier this year, so things have moved on with the data. If someone is a member of the library, there's usually a little stack of books next to them.
Sorry, we're not seeing the screen.
Oh.
I can share mine if you like.
Dear me, we've only been sharing screen for 3 years. Is that better?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So these slides are slightly out of date now. So these screenshots are a little bit out of date because we've made some more advancements to the website. So we have people in the database who are library members and who are authors. Now, Hugh Gain in the live version of the database has a little stack of books next to him here, and that indicates that he is a library member. Anyone who's an author has a nice little quill, and anyone who's both has both symbols. But once you've found the record, you can navigate it. So we can see biographical details for the library member, you can see their occupation, any library memberships that they have, because some people are members of multiple libraries. We can also see any books that they've authored and any people that they are related to. Now, all of the text that's underlined is linked to other records, so you can click through those and explore. Okay, so if I was to click through the member of the New York Society Library, it would bring up that information that I've just shown you on the screen, but you can click through sort of relationships to James Parker and other people. And you can also explore an individual's borrowing records if they're available. So you can see which books they borrowed, you can see when they borrowed them and how long for. Brilliant. Okay, so this is Hugh Gain's borrowing records, and this is from the City Readers data. So I'm going was on my backup slides. Yeah, so you can see which work was borrowed. You can see which of the volumes was borrowed because these are often multi-volume works. And this is great because we can see that Gain was borrowing the historical and geographic dictionary, and he borrows it in order. Borrowing volume 1, returning it, then 2, returning it, and then 3. Not everyone reads like that in the 18th century, so that's quite interesting in and of itself. Moving on, if we wanted to do a search for a book, at the top of this simple search option, we'd select work, and you can do a few things here that I wanted to try and show you, but you could type in America in any word and search for any books with America in the title. If you add an asterisk to that, you'd it would be America and American, which expands the search a little bit more. But the text I wanted to talk about here was Jonathan Carver's travels through the interior parts of North America. So what we can see is that there are lovely. So if I was to click through onto Jonathan Carver, it comes through with biographical information about him. We learn that he has 2 different works that are both held in libraries across the British Atlantic. And by clicking on the banner for the borrowing records, we can see that where these books are being borrowed, who they're being borrowed by, personal information about those borrowers, the dates borrowed, and the dates that they were returned. We're asked quite a lot about editions. So these are the 4 editions that we know or very, very strongly suspect were of this book that were held. And they are all linked through to the ESTC record, which is a separate website hosted by the British Library. If we were to click on the banner held by libraries, you can see that this book's held in 26 different libraries. I think it's wrong. I think that's actually 27 now, but we know that it's held in at least 26 libraries, and they're all click-throughable, so you can find out where all of these are and find out a little bit more about them. And then by clicking onto the borrowing information for this book, again, you can see who's borrowing these works, and you can filter by library. And I wanted to flag as well, I don't have a slide for this, I don't think, but all of this is customizable. So if you only wanted to look for who's reading this book in libraries in North America, you're able to add a condition and filter. So Bristol appears first, I think, it's either by date or it's organized by date here. So you can add conditions and filter this out. This is great if there's large amounts of information, because it helps you to filter out what you need, and then you can use CSV, the Excel, or the PDF to export the data and use that for whatever analysis you wanted to do, if that was something you were interested in doing. Something I wanted to flag as well with the biographical information is we've deliberately kept these quite brief. They're to give you a flavour of each library member rather than a full biography, especially for the really famous people that we're thinking about. We also wanted to give people there's some really interesting readers who are we don't know very much about them, so we really wanted to give people a flavour of that. That said, if you notice anything on there that isn't right, or you have more information on that individual, I think we do have an email inbox, so please contact us and let us know, and we're more than happy to update records. So if anyone is, if you have specific information on people, please feel free to contact us. Oh yes, so this is once you've exported that data in Excel, how it will appear and what you can do with it. And what I've done here is just filtered out, added a condition to say any female readers who were reading this borrowing record, and it only returns one result, a Mrs. Mary Adams in Bristol, who is the only woman that we know was reading Jonathan Carver's Travels Through North America. And I've already talked about libraries, so I will just skip through that. If you've got a query that can't be resolved using the advanced search, using the simple search, we do have advanced search options as well. Mark, I'm not sure in the interest of time if it's the best use of the time for me to talk this through, especially because we can't do it live.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So this is the bit. These are backup slides we prepared in the summer, and this function has been the last one that has been properly developed. So Sophie, I think you're right. This one is probably not one to talk through in detail, but it will allow you to highlight, I think one of the things we were talking about, Sophie, earlier today, is that this search allows you to situate, particularly if you're coming from New York or interested in the New York Society Library, to situate the New York readers comparatively against readers that have similar characteristics. So one of the examples we looked at was people who attended Edinburgh University, was that right? And there's a couple of, am I remembering that rightly? There's a couple of New York folk that had Edinburgh University backgrounds, and you compare them to people at Cork in Ireland, or Wigton in Scotland, or Bristol and Edinburgh in England, who all have that same university background, and then you can compare them directly for what they're reading.
That's right. I was trying, in fact, I might be able to, if I load it offline.
Well, I've done that.
Then...
So
oh, great. Okay.
Should we try doing that?
Because one thing I wanted to show, what I've done here, I've done the advanced search. I've done advanced search on members, and I put a filter on for anyone who's a member at the New York Society Library. And what we can do is then play around to see those of them that we know have a university education, where they studied. So unsurprisingly, Yale comes out quite high. But if we were to put the filter on Edinburgh, and then take that filter off New York, all of a sudden we have all of these contemporaries of Dr. Samuel Bard, MD, who were also studying at Edinburgh. So all these contemporaries who were all studying in Edinburgh, possibly around the same time, but it widens that search out. Obviously, the website's behaving now that we've turned it off.
Should we move on to ranks then? So what makes the database misbehave is that we've got over 250,000 records that are split across a lot of different record types. And to do the counting, when we are counting particularly the loans, it is pulling data from lots and lots and lots of different places. So it really struggles to display it on browsers, and when the connection is being used for other things, that just makes it crash. But it has all loaded. We'll go back to the slides. I think that's a good idea. So what we also do, you can see that there's a third major tab for organizing the data. We've got 4 ways of searching across all of the data and simply counting things comparatively. So a really simple place to start is our rank libraries table, which is shown on this slide. And the rank libraries table essentially shows you what we have in the database. So it will show you that, for instance, very, very few libraries have borrowing records. And it will show you which ones those are. It also shows you, frankly, how important New York is, because it's right there at the top in terms of the number of borrowing events that we have. It also shows you how small some of these collections are. You can see on this screen, the Air Library Society is barely going at this stage. You've also got several other kinds of libraries, but there are quite a lot of libraries, if you look elsewhere on the list, that only have 50 or 100 books. I think the smallest library, and I'll manipulate the data live off screen, the smallest library that we actually have worked on so far has 25 books, and that's the Niagara Library. The Stranraer Library in Scotland has 35 books. So you're looking at some places that are very, very small, and you're looking at others that have been going for 50 years and have a lot of books. So it gives you a sense of the comparisons. And again, as with other tables, you can sort this by data type. So you can look at libraries in Pennsylvania, sort them by foundation date, sort them by size and scale. If you skip, and again, as Sophie has said, on the next slide, we see that these are linked. So everything in blue links to the record. and on the next slide, you can see the sorting. So I've looked here for libraries in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to compare them comparatively. The next rank that we look at is ranking books. And this is where things get very, very exciting, because this allows us to see comparatively across the different kinds of data that we've got, essentially how popular certain books are. And what we've done first here is, and this data is on this slide is now very out of date because we've added more records since this. But what this data allows us to do is look at the books by how many times they're borrowed. So at this point in time, Edward Gibbon was borrowed most frequently, but Henry Fielding's novels are there. Don Quixote is there at number 8 on the list, borrowed 488 times. Of course, a lot of 18th century books are published in multi-volume format, and that skews this number, because to be able to read Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in complete form, you have to borrow 6 times. You have to borrow 6 different volumes. So what we also then do is look at unique borrowers, because this tells us how many, which is, Sophie, if you skip 2 more slides. So here we go on the left-hand slide, we've sorted by unique borrowers. So that gives us a sense of how many individual people are borrowing a book. So it's a different sense of popularity, and it's intended, comparing those 2 numbers gives us a sense. It tries to remove out of the equation that skew that the multi-volume format provides for the popularity of book. Then we've also thought about the comparative context. So obviously, as I was explaining earlier, we have borrowing records for very, very few libraries. What we've done is tried to look at how many books are held, how many libraries hold these specific books. And that gives us a different number entirely. So on the right-hand screen, you can see that while William Robertson's History of the Reign of Emperor Charles V is not actually borrowed by that many unique borrowers, it is in the most collections at this snap point in time. My favorite example of this is Adam Smith, who's not actually borrowed by that many people at all across our 5 libraries relative to the other books on this list. But he is one of those books. Wealth of Nations, it's a book we've all heard of, and even in the 18th century is one of those books that everyone thinks they should own. So if we could skip 3 slides back. I just want to highlight Don Quixote again, because one of the really interesting things that New York has done to our data has been to pull out some really interesting differences between New York and Burlington and the libraries that we already had data for. So places like Bristol or Wigton in Scotland. Don Quixote, the loans that you see there for Don Quixote, over 50% of those are actually accounted for by New York. And Don Quixote is actually not that heavily borrowed at places like Bristol. That's true of the London Magazine, which is also on that list. The only place where the London Magazine is being borrowed in our database is New York. And you can see that it's not held by very many other libraries. Similarly, the Sporting Magazine, if we were to show you the full list live, Fanny Burney's Cecilia, and one of the early sort of didactic novels written by and for young women. Eliza Hayward's Betsy Thoughtless. These are books that as soon as we added the City Readers data at Christmas time, simply popped to the top of the list. They weren't anywhere on our lists. And then adding the New York data gives us a completely different sense of what is popular. That is true if we skip forward slides to think about authors. One of the things that we can do with the ranking books, as we can do with every other list here, is give the data specific search terms. So in this slide, I have asked the books borrowed ranking to tell me how books borrowed by Charlotte Turner Smith a female novelist and poet and political writer, actually, of the 1790s principally. And this lists all of her books in the database and shows you how many times they're borrowed. And compare those, the left-hand column with the two right-hand columns. This is an author who's not actually in that many libraries yet, but it is an author who is being borrowed very heavily at a very small number of libraries, specifically New York. Charlotte Turner Smith was nowhere in our data until we added New York. And suddenly she pops. If you go to the next slide, I hope, and then the next slide, there you go. Charlotte Turner Smith pops to the very top of the list in terms of authors. So we've gone to a separate list now, which is rank authors. And this is the authors ranked by how many times their books collectively are borrowed or held. And you can see that Charlotte Turner Smith is very, very high on this list. But she's not alone. So someone like Fanny Burney, someone like Madame Jean Lee, these are authors who are really not borrowed somewhere like Bristol, but they are borrowed very heavily in New York. So there's something very interesting going on here. And what I've done in the next slide, you'll remember that we can sort our data on these ranking tables according to different methods. So what I've done here is sort the same list of authors by the number of libraries that hold their books, rather than on the previous slide by the number of times their books are borrowed. And a very, very interesting thing has happened, which is that all of the female authors have disappeared off this list. If you could go one back again, Sophie, thank you. So here we see that there are several authors in the top 15, there are 3. In the top 40, there's about 10 female authors in terms of works borrowed. If we move to the next slide, there are no female authors in the top 40 books held by libraries. And that tells us something very interesting about the book buying habits of libraries collectively. Now, these authors clearly are very popular in New York. They are very popular too in Hatboro, I think, as well. That's right, Sophie, Betsy Thoughtless. But these authors, and female authors particularly, it seems, do not seem to be canonical. And that's something that's really interesting and pops out of the data immediately. So our ranking tables tell us something very interesting. Sophie, did you want to add something there? No, sorry. Okay, so the next slide is the final ranking table. And I think this is where we'll pause and stop for questions. But the ranking borrowers allows us to look at specifically at borrowers in the same way as we've looked at books and authors. And this again allows us to dive into the collection and well, actually zoom out from the collection and look at all of the people in our database and how they're behaving. Again, this is the very top of the list, but the list has over 9,000 people in it. So there's a lot that this list can do. You can expand it. You can show 100 entries at a time. You can download the whole thing. You can also organize it yourself. So on the next slide, Sophie, you'll see that we have looked at the left-hand side. We've asked the database to count just the library members who are women. And that tells us really interesting things. So you'll see that one of the reasons why New York's really interesting in terms of reading habits is actually that women are borrowing far more than they tend to at a lot of other libraries, and a lot more women are borrowing things. At Bristol, there's a few very, very prolific borrowers, but women are not very prominent. And on the right-hand side, we have searched for MPs, because MPs' borrowing habits are quite interesting, right? Because they really have an active say in political affairs. And someone like Richard Lovell Edgeworth there, the father of Maria Edgeworth, the author, his borrowing records are very, very interesting indicator of what a politician might be reading. Peter Bailey at the top of that list, I think he is someone that one of the PhD students who's starting to use this data has been working on. And his borrowings give us a sense of what someone who is aspiring to become an MP is borrowing. He's not actually elected an MP until the early years of the 19th century. And then, of course, we can pop out from that and we can follow the links and we can think about Mary Adams and we can think about the books that she's borrowed and we can trace her reading habits. Mary Adams, the first few things she's borrowed are very, very traditional, stereotypical female fare. She borrows a lot of the books that are talking to women about what they should read. She then takes something off the shelf which is really wacky, which is one of the very first histories of India, written by someone in the East India Company who's come back and written this really scholarly history. She has that book for about 6 weeks. And then she comes back, returns that book, and then borrows Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. So she goes back to novels, which is much more stereotypical female fare. So this data, hopefully, and I'm really excited to see people starting to use it, but this data is hopefully going to tell us some really interesting stories about what 18th century people are reading and how that fits with their life and their interests, their biographies, their beliefs. It's also hopefully going to tell us a lot more about these books. Many of the New York books obviously still survive on the shelves. Many of these books that are being borrowed, many of the Bristol books still survive on those shelves that are being borrowed. So we can follow this data in all sorts of really exciting ways. I think if that's okay with you, Sophie, we'll stop there and we'll take any questions or any suggestions that you might have. But thank you so much for your time and thank you for bearing with us with the technical issues we've had. I hope we gave you a good sense of what's coming.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I really can't wait to get my hands on this database. There's going to be some terrific stuff in there. I mean, just to look up books that I know and am familiar with from the 18th century and kind of see who was reading them then. So we have some great questions in the live stream chat, and we've invited on screen Barbara Beek, who is the New York Society Library Special Collections Librarian, so she's going to join us for a little conversation also. Those joining us on live stream, do feel free to continue to add questions or comments to the chat there or to email them to me. My email address is a little farther up in the feed there. So starting with a question here that I'm not familiar with this, so I'm just reading this aloud. Any meshing with the old computerized project for historical biobibliography at Newcastle, which compiled book subscription lists?
So that would be a wonderful thing to think about in the future. It is very much one of those projects that would potentially be on the horizon. One of the things that we're really excited with is open data linkage, open link data. We have one of the co-investigators on the project is Matthew Sangster. Sorry, name escaped me for that. Matthew Sangster. He's at Glasgow University, but he is also has the same role on a project that colleagues at the University of Stirling have been doing on Scottish borrowing records in the 18th century, which are mainly university borrowing records, they're church borrowing records. They're very interesting, the different types of library. We'd love to plug them in one day to get the data being read together. Similarly, our main Sydney collaborator, Simon Burrows, has produced, actually 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he produced something called the French Book Trade in Enlightenment Europe database. And that looked at booksellers' records and wholesale book circulation records that wholesalers were sending out and selling to people throughout Europe. So there are several of these different types of bibliographical projects of various ages, and it would be wonderful to find a way to plug them together. The blue skies vision that we have is that we'll ultimately, and it's within our power really, we just have to work out how to do it, we'll ultimately be able to create this, obviously not complete because not all of the records survive, but this digital reconstruction of the book circulation world of 18th century Europe and North America. That Newcastle project would absolutely could be part of it. I guess one of the technical challenges is getting into the older hardware. Simon's certainly been able to do that for the French project that I mentioned, because he's got into a 90s access database and has been able to extract the data and compare it with his. So there are ways of doing it. We have questions about funding and resource, but I'm one of the things we've always tried to do is work with people from the outset that might one day come together to build this more connected thing.
Yeah, thank you. I want to know this also, so I'm just going to hop in one more question from the chat here. Noticing the assignment of religious affiliations, I mean, I understand it if somebody was Anglican or Episcopalian because they'd have the church records with their names in it, but how do we know if somebody is a dissenter or a deist, and how those specific words, you know, how are people categorized in those specific terms?
Would you like to start, Sophie? I can talk to the deist bit.
I can't talk to dissenters. I can talk to, so they are not entirely complete for everyone, but so they're not terms that I've come across when I've been researching the North American members, but I have probably unsurprisingly come across Quaker members. And where we've captured that is if we've been looking for information about these people quite often on Ancestry, and it comes up that, you know, we found them in a Quaker meeting book or Quaker marriage records. We've made a little note to say that they are Quakers. The same, there's a really interesting Jewish family at the New York Society Library as well, the Franks family. And there are people from the Franks family who don't even live in New York. Moses Franks, I want to say, he lives in London, and sent the subscription money when the library opens, and he purchases the books. As far as we know, he never actually goes back to New York or reads anything. So it's when we've been doing the biographical research on people, and we've noticed that that's the source that the information is recorded in. That's why we've captured it. Mark, can you speak a little bit to deists? Because I'm not.
Yeah, sure. There's two separate things that I'll add to that. One is the broad and general point, which is to research every 18th century library member in the same depth would take 40, 50, 60 years of a team of 4 or 5 or 15. It's potentially one area where the community dimension might come in. This is a resource that we really hope family historians will find useful, but equally they might be able to, I mean, my old PhD supervisor has looked at it, is really interested in family history, and has given me amazing level of detail on one of the ancestors that he has found in our data. So there's potentially a way in which this information could get in there, but we decided to prioritize for the highest level of biographical research we could manage those libraries that either we were partnering with, like New York or Bristol, or for which we wanted to talk about. Again, New York or Bristol, but also several others. So there's a few libraries where we've gone all out with the biographical research, and the user notes are going to make clear which ones they are and how to identify them on the database. The other thing that it's worth noting is that the religious landscape in different bits of our subject area is very, very complex. And things that mean some things in certain areas don't mean the same things elsewhere. So it is something that we'll be having a glossary for, but it is also was one of those things that was quite complex to work out when we were working out the data structures. How do we define things? In England, particularly in Bristol, one of the things that makes Bristol just quite an unreliable thing for everyone to have been citing for 60 years is that Bristol is a very serious library. It has a lot of serious scholars in it. And our colleague Matt Scronsberg, who did all the work on Bristol, was able to pinpoint that this person who wrote this thing was borrowing lots of books and is known to have been a deist. Equally, there's lots of sort of, because I did my PhD on this stuff on the Scottish libraries, there's a lot of data on all of the different congregations that Scottish library members were part of. So it is potentially really complex, and there's really interesting things that could be pulled out of it. It's the Catholics alongside the Presbyterians, alongside the Anglicans in the same Scottish or Irish library. Those are really interesting things to pursue. It's one of the many, many things that we hope people will pull out of this. And they can also run with it themselves. You can download all of these tables. And if you want to run with the research and take it further, you're absolutely entitled and empowered to do that.
That's great. Barbara, would you like to throw in a question or comment? from your perspective?
I just want to say thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic. For the people watching from home, Mark approached the library back in 2018 to be a project partner. We were enthusiastic. You know, we've been really anticipating this database for a while. So this presentation today was really fantastic and very exciting to see what we're going to be able to tool around with, hopefully in a little bit. And I just want to say the library is very proud to be a project partner on this. And we're really excited to see different ways that this data is going to be able to get out further past city readers and what scholars and researchers are going to end up doing with it. To that note, I do have a follow-up question. You touched on it a little bit when you were talking about your ranking tables and what the book buying habits of libraries for female authors. Could you talk about any other sort of discoveries you've had with the data so far that you've mined that maybe you weren't aware of previously or hadn't had the data to back up?
I think one really interesting thing that Mark and I were talking about this morning that came from City Readers is we're working with the ESTC data, which tells us all of the known surviving 18th century books that were printed in the English language. One thing we found as we've been working through the data is there appear to be some editions that seem to have slipped through the net. And the records are so complete that we think that the edition probably did exist, but there's no record of it. And we were talking this morning about a text that only seems to be in New York. We only know it from City Readers. We can't find it anywhere, and it's called Happy Release. And it's borrowed quite widely. And maybe Mark can talk a little bit more about the detail, but the data is certainly throwing up things that we didn't know existed. And there's potential there for it to really enhance what we already know. And I think that book's a really great example because, you know, this isn't just an edition of something, you know, oh, we didn't know there was a Newcastle edition from 1797. This is a completely new book that we don't know about, that doesn't seem to appear until the 1820s, but it's being read in New York in 1800. So we don't have a full, this is it. So we don't have a full understanding of what it is, who it's by, where it's published, but we know it existed and we know that New Yorkers were reading it. So maybe it's a local publication, but yeah, there's a few sort of instances like that that are really exciting, kind of confusing and make us scratch our heads, but also really exciting to try and chase down and find out a little bit more about them.
Yeah, I mean, what we know about 18th century print is what survives, and ESTC is what survives and is compiled by libraries reporting to ESTC. But one of the things that large-scale digital analysis of books has started to do has been to reveal the books that don't survive. So this is the most obvious example because it's being borrowed so heavily, and I had to go in and create a work for it because there is no, so I had to create the data for this because ESTC provides no data on this. It is not in the British Library, it's not in the Library of Congress, it's not in ESTC, it's not anywhere. So it's a really interesting thing. Our colleague Norbert Schurer, I think, found several more in one of the other English libraries we're looking at, and they tend to be novels. They tend to have one printing. It's really exciting. There's a big project that has been going 20 years at the University of St Andrews, which is intending to capture all known printed objects in Europe before 1700. It's massive. It's called the Universal Short Title Catalogue. They're stopping at 1700 because after 1700 it just becomes just incredibly vast. But the thing that was really striking for them was similarly the sheer number of stuff they were finding evidence of that clearly does not exist anymore, or that we do not know exists. So things like this project help fill in bits, and other projects like ours fill in bits of the book landscape that simply we don't know about otherwise. And I think you looked at this on early American imprints for this title, Sophie, this morning, and the only two hits for the New York Society Library's catalogue. So anywhere we look, the New York Society Library seems to be the only hint. And I've looked back. City Readers is fantastic because it lets you get into the visual, the image of the original source. I've looked at the records. It says Happy Retreat, happy release. The transcribers have got the title right.
Excellent. That's actually what I just pulled up to make sure when you were talking about
this is just not a book that seems to survive anywhere. I mean, it would be amazing if it's on your shelves somewhere, because if that would be true, that has a fairly good chance that's probably the only unique surviving copy in a library. But it's a ghost book. Really exciting. Things that we didn't know otherwise. I think the most striking thing for me is how far Bristol has completely skewed what we know, because this pioneering scholar in the 1960s did this work on the Bristol Library Society in its first 10 years. That has been the thing that every historian, and I come at this as a historian working on the history of ideas in the Enlightenment, and every single scholar that wants to say anything about the history of circulation of a book in the British-speaking world has only been able to cite Paul Kaufman for 60 years. But Bristol was a really, I think, New York and Burlington and Hatboro and Wigton showed that Bristol is a very, very unusual kind of subscription library. And that's endorsed if you then look at the catalogues, in that some things that are being very heavily borrowed at Bristol just are not registering in most libraries because it's very specialist. There's a lot of very heavily, highly educated, highly articulate men borrowing books in Bristol. A lot of very, very well-known doctors, writers, clergymen. And yet this library and the first 10 years of that library have stood in for every other library for the last 60 years. So I think what really excites me is what we can now say and find out about the circulation of these books by looking at a wider corpus of material. That's the big thing for me.
This is really fantastic.
And by the way, I mean, you said it was honored to be part of the project. It's an amazing honor for us to work with libraries like yours.
Good. We're going to move toward wrapping up, but I have one more. There's a couple more good questions in the chat. Do feel free to be in touch with us, live stream audience, and other ways we can always answer those offline. But I want to toss in this one. So do you have the sense from looking at the borrowers, are these largely people who would have owned books and borrowed them from a library? If so, are there some books that individual people feel they should own? There are books that individual libraries feel that people should read, and then there are the books that they actually check out from the library. There's the category of, I should have this on my personal shelf, but then I'm going to borrow this other stuff from the library.
It's really, we think that's happening. I mentioned about Hugh Game reads books in order, and that's unusual because we definitely have examples where people either read volumes out of order, and we think that the scholarship shows that actually that's just how people read in the 18th century. But we also suspect that some people might have access to particular books out of the library. So maybe they have volume 1 of something and then they use the library to borrow others. Without having, the way we would find that out is probably by looking at their wills, inventories, any sort of record where we know what people owned. And we just can't do that for everyone. So maybe that's a case study for someone to do with the help of our database to find someone's will or record of their own personal library, where they'd have a couple of books, a small number of books, and see how that compares. But yeah, we certainly think that could be happening. We just can't prove it without sort of doing a whole other project.
It's something that I'd love to do in terms of extending the database, because there are private inventories of inventories of what people owned, and that could also be treated in a similar way. We also there is a way to get to what Sophie's saying there. for one of the very early silly little pieces of work that I did years and years ago on Wigton, actually, you can actually prove by looking at the because it's such a small library, that library borrowing is dominated by the lower class people that are members of it. So that it's dominated by the innkeepers, the miller, several widows. It also has quite a few people that have a lot more money, and in some cases we can evidence that they owned quite a lot of books. They don't tend to borrow books, so they might be investing in a library as a civic good and part of investing in infrastructure. Equally, the tailor who is borrowing a lot of books from Wigton, by the time he dies in 1820, his will says he owns 200 books. But when he's reading in the 1790s and borrowing books, you know, that may be his entry to print. There is one other type of reader, and this is a type of reader that's common at New York as well because of the way New York builds its collection. This guy, Matthew Brickdale, is Bristol's MP. He's a very influential man. You can see down here, he borrows 144 books. The really weird thing is that Matthew Brickdale donated most of the books to the library himself. So there's a separate printed catalogue. If we go back to, if we can find my way back to Bristol, there is a separate. It may not load. It doesn't matter the actual proof. But there's a separate printed catalogue of the books that he donated to the library, and then you find him borrowing those books from the library. So there's almost there are some people who I think Burlington, I think I'm right in saying, is almost entirely built from donated books initially. So there are some people through which donating their own books is a way of building this society, this civic good, which I think is a really interesting thing. And I'm hoping that one of us will think more about in the future.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up, because I'm conscious of time, but Burlington, the library is founded by book donations rather than book purchases, and one person donates about 150 of his own books. There's also the Reverend donates books that he's borrowed from other people, and he donates them by mistake, so then has to give those back and then buy new books. So that's a really fun story. But yeah, there's a higher ambition of some sort of lofty civic ideal, as well as simply access to books, and that people are willing to pool their resources so literally and not have their books at home. But Burlington is it's a really interesting history, and it's a slightly I'm writing about this at the moment. It's a slightly different library to what's happening in New York. So
excellent. Well, and it just shows a passion for books too. I think, you know, it's like, this was great, I want to share it with everybody else, but I also might want to reread it. I mean, it's a kind of basic impulse for everybody who loves to read, perhaps. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mark Towsey. Thank you, Sophie Jones. Thank you, everybody who has joined us. We will have a lot more information to come about the database and how to use it when it becomes public. So do keep an eye on the New York Society Libraries publications. We'll talk a lot more about that in the future. And I've collected some of the other questions that we got from the chat, and we'll add some details about those items as well. So thank you very much. Best of luck on the next stage.
Oh, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for the really interesting questions as well.
Thank you. Thanks for letting us share it with you.